Wednesday more, and today we'll be studying finite and non-finite verbs in the theme English grammar structural patterns. Before we go into our lesson, let's take a look at our objectives. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to define finite verbs, define non-finite verbs, make sentences with finite and non-finite verbs, state the functions of non-finite verbs, and state the differences between finite and non-finite verbs. Now let's go to our lesson. Verbs are words that show action or a state of being. Now, finite verbs are the group of verbs that can express tense, that is the time an action takes place, person, and number. They mostly express present and past tenses. Finite verbs specify the action carried out by the subjects of the sentences. Finite verbs are verbs that express tenses, either present tense or past tense. Note that tense refers to a verb in relation to the time of action. So if a verb can tell you an action occurred yesterday or an action occurs presently, that verb is a finite verb. Simply put, if a verb can have a past tense form and a present tense form, that verb is a finite verb. Now let's look at the examples we have on the board. Nkiru bakes delicious cakes. Bakes here is a finite verb because it helps to express this sentence in the present tense. Nkiru bakes delicious cakes. It shows you that that is what Nkiru does regularly, or not necessarily that she does it at the time when you're speaking, but it's something she does regularly, or it's something she has been doing. So it's in the present. So this verb here, which shows present tense, is a finite verb because from our definition, we said they are verbs that can express tense. They can tell you the time an action takes place. We also have my teacher was in school on Monday. Was is a past tense verb. My teacher was in school on Monday. So this verb was is a finite verb because it can express tense. It has shown us from this sentence that the action or this sentence has happened yesterday. And then we have another sentence here. The computer suddenly stopped functioning. Stopped is a past tense verb. It has expressed the past tense, so it is a finite verb. And lastly, we have Yusuf made me happy when he gave me a birthday present. Both verbs made and gave are in the past tense. They express past tense actions. So these verbs here, bakes, was, stopped, made, and gave, are finite verbs because they express tense, either present or past tense. Now note that finite verbs function as the main verbs of independent clauses or sentences. Independent clauses are sentences that can stand on their own and make meaning. So finite verbs always function as the main verbs of sentences or independent clauses. Now let's look at examples of sentences or some sentences containing finite verbs. The first one we have here is Rumokoro is the name of a place. Is in the present tense, so it's a finite verb. Onyeka and I went shopping at Spar over the weekend. Went is a past tense verb, so it is a finite verb. While mother cooked the food, Jide told me some stories. Both verbs are in past tense, cooked and told, so they are finite verbs also. My sister bakes a lot, but I love to farm. with grammar. Bakes and love are verbs in present tense, so they are also finite verbs. Eno washes her school uniform almost every day. Washes is a verb in present tense. It's also a finite verb. The debate team came to my class for rehearsals after school. Came is a verb in past tense, so it's a finite verb also. I love my job a lot. It keeps me busy all day. Both verbs are in present tense, so they are finite verbs. And lastly, you spent the whole day washing your clothes. Spent is a past tense verb, which makes it a finite verb. So basically, finite verbs are verbs that can be expressed in present tense or past tense. So when you have a verb and you can say or you can use that verb in a sentence in past tense or present tense, that verb is a finite verb. Now, what are non-finite verbs? Simply the opposite of finite verbs. They are verbs that do not necessarily tell the time an action takes place. They do not specify tense, person, or number. They rather function as nouns or adjectives in sentences. While finite verbs express tense, number, that is, they can tell you how many people performed the action, or person, is it a man or a woman, Non-finite verbs cannot express tense. They do not express tense or person or number. Rather, they perform the function of nouns or adjectives in sentences. For example, I dislike writing long essays. One would think that because there is ing here, this is in continuous tense, present continuous or past continuous, whatever it is. But the verb writing here, if you look at it properly, does not express or does not represent the time this action takes place or will take place. If you tell someone, I dislike writing, it doesn't even mean you are writing at the time or you have written before. It just passes the information. It doesn't tell you about the time of the action. So, writing is a non-finite verb here. And then we have on Monday, I decided to pay grandma a visit. Pay also does not express any form of tense. Our teachers are having a meeting. Non-finite verb also. When are we going home? Non-finite verb, going. Temitope has gone to the field for training. Gone is also a non-finite verb. So what you have to note about non-finite verbs is that they do not express tense, person, or number. They cannot tell you when an action will take place, or when it took place, or whether it is taking place at the time the speaker is making the sentence. Non-finite verbs perform certain functions in sentences. The first function of non-finite verbs is that they can function as infinitives. Secondly, they can function as gerunds. And they can also function as present participles and past participles. So these four are the functions or the roles played by non-finite verbs in sentences. Now let's look at them one after the other. Non-finite verbs as infinitives. What are infinitives? Infinitives are the base forms of verbs without any suffix or inflection. What that means is that infinitives simply represent the verb as it is, the way you find it in your dictionary without any suffix at the end, without extra letters in front or at the back, the way the verb is, the way you would find it in a dictionary. For example, stay, go, eat, jump, play, write, and so on and so forth. The way the verb is without adding ed or ing or whatever you have. The base form of a verb is known as infinitive, the infinitive form of the verb. Sometimes infinitives are preceded by to. but at other times, the verbs occur without to. When you have infinitives in sentences, a good way to identify them is that sometimes in front of the verbs, you have the word to do, to eat, to write, to play. Sometimes you have the word to preceding the base form of a verb. So when you find to something in your sentence, just identify that verb as an infinitive. But other times, the base form of the verbs occur like that without to at the beginning. For example, here we have sentences where some non-finite verbs function as infinitives. First one here says, I decided to go home after the long meeting we had. Now note that here we have to go. Whenever you find to in a sentence preceding a verb, that verb is usually an infinitive. It's usually in the base form without ing or ed. You cannot say, I decided to go in, or I decided to cook the food. It will be wrong. So when you find to preceding a verb, that verb is an infinitive, and it usually appears in the base form or the ordinary form. Then we also have, whenever I stay at home, I just sleep. Now note that in this second sentence, the verbs are not preceded by to, they occur alone. Stay and sleep. But they are all infinitives because they are the base form of the verbs. Remember we said infinitives simply refers to base form or the base form of verbs, the dictionary forms of verbs. And then lastly we have, I wanted to attend rehearsals today, but I didn't get to. Here we have the word to preceding the verb attend. Attend is an infinitive. Now note that infinitives preceded by to are called to infinitives, while those without to are called bare infinitives. When you find infinitives or the base form of verbs in a sentence, and you find the preposition to occurring before the verb, that expression is known as to infinitive, or those expressions are known as to infinitives. But when you have a sentence that just has the base form of a verb without the preposition to, it is known as a bare infinitive. Non-finite verbs also perform the function of gerunds in sentences. What are gerunds? Gerunds are non-finite verbs that play the role of nouns in a sentence, either as the subject or object. They usually end with the suffix ing. So when you find a verb which ends in ing in a sentence but plays the role of a noun, such a verb is known as a gerund. For example, reading is something I enjoy doing a lot. Here, reading stands as the subject of this sentence. Ngowari loves going to the cinema. Here, the gerund going stands as the object of this sentence. Remember we said gerunds can either play the role of the subject or an object. And then the third sentence we have here says, do you enjoy singing like I do? Here the gerund also plays the role of the object. And lastly, dancing is a hobby I started at a very young age. Here dancing, which is the gerund, functions as the subject of this sentence. So all these verbs, or all these gerunds, reading, going, singing, and dancing, are non-finite verbs. So when you find a gerund in a sentence and you're asked to identify the non-finite verbs, simply identify those gerunds as non-finite verbs. Because wherever you find gerunds, they function or they are non-finite verbs which function as gerunds. Now note that not all ing verbs are gerunds. They are only gerunds when they function like nouns. You don't always find ing verbs as gerunds. Most times, ing verbs express a progressive or continuous tense, but they are only gerunds when such verbs play the role of nouns in sentences. Now let's look at how non-finite verbs play the role of present participles. What are present participles, or what is a present participle? Present participle is a form of a verb which shows that an action is continuous or in progress. The form of a verb that shows that an action is continuous or in progress. That is a present participle. Now, verbs in present participle usually end in ing. A good example is I am teaching, which is what I'm doing right now. So the verb teaching has ing at the end, so it's expressed in present participle. Now, infinitives, non-finite verbs, function as present participles. Now, let's look at the examples we have here. I am going to Nneka's house to do my assignment. Going is the present participle. Now, note that whenever you find present participles in sentences, they function or they are non-finite verbs, because being a present participle is a function of non-finite verbs. So the verb going is a non-finite verb. Then we also have, were you eating when your friends came visiting? This is also a non-finite verb because it is a verb expressed in present participle. We also have, we saw people cutting trees as we walked to the farm. The verb cutting is expressed in present participle, so it is a non-finite verb. And lastly, Elisha and Elijah were playing Scrabble in the sitting room. Playing is a verb expressed in present participle, so it's a non-finite verb. So whenever you have verbs in present participle preceded by auxiliary verbs, here you have am, or sometimes they are not preceded by auxiliary verbs, but most other times you find auxiliary verbs before them, like our first example, I am going to Nneka's house to do my assignment, and Elisha and Elijah were playing Scrabble in the sitting room. So when you find present participle verbs, identify such verbs as non-finite verbs because they are what non-finite verbs function as. Identify such verbs as non-finite verbs. Now, when non-finite verbs perform the role of present participles, they sometimes play the role of adjectives. When you have non-finite verbs functioning as present participles, sometimes such non-finite verbs play the role of adjectives. Non-finite verbs that function as adjectives can end with ing or ed as suffixes. Present participle verbs that are a function of non-finite verbs usually end in ing or ed. For example, the child dipped her hand into the boiling water. Now, if you remember what adjectives are words that describe or modify or tell you more about a noun. Now, if you look at this sentence here, the child dipped her hand into the boiling water. The word boiling describes the water. So it functions as an adjective even though it's a verb. It's a verb because it has ing, and only verbs can take ing to show tense, present continuous, or some form of progressive tense. But it functions here as an adjective because it provides more information about water. Boiling water. What kind of water? Boiling water. So this present participle here, which is a non-finite verb, functions here as an adjective modifying the noun water. Let's look at our second example. My younger sister loves boiled eggs. Boiled here is also a verb because of the suffix ed here. Only verbs can take the suffix ed to show past tense. But here, the verb boiled functions as an adjective because it describes the noun eggs. Boiled eggs. You can as well say fried eggs. So here it functions as a present participle, which is a non-finite verb. And then we also have, be careful so you do not wake the sleeping baby. Sleeping here is a verb in present participle, but here it functions as an adjective because it describes the noun baby, sleeping baby. And lastly, we have mashed potatoes taste really delicious. Mashed here is a verb, but here in this sentence it performs the function of an adjective. It describes the noun potatoes, mashed potatoes. So, present participles or non-finite verbs that function as present participles play the role of adjectives in sentences. And note that they end either in ing or ed. Another function of non-finite verbs is that they play the role of past participles. What is a past participle? A past participle or the past participle form of a verb is a form of a verb that represents a past action which has been completed. Past participles represent a past action which has been completed. Past participles usually have the auxiliary verbs had, has, or have preceding them. What this means is that when you find a verb in past participle, you must have the auxiliary verbs have, has, or had before such verbs. So if you want to make a verb or if you want to say a verb in past participle, simply place any of those auxiliary verbs have, had, or has before the verb. And then the form of the verb you realize is the past participle. For example, we have Ikenna has done his assignment. The verb done here is in past participle. Why? Because we have the auxiliary verb has preceding it. So done here is a non-finite verb because non-finite verbs function as past participles. We also have I wished I had stayed back at home. Stayed here is in the past participle because it is preceded by the auxiliary verb had. So the verb stayed is a non-finite verb functioning as a past participle verb. And then lastly, Mr. Karebi and his family had traveled for the holidays before the storm. The verb traveled here is in past participle because the verb had precedes it. The auxiliary verb had precedes it. So traveled is a non-finite verb functioning as a past participle. So non-finite verbs also function as past participles in sentences. Now let's look at the differences between finite verbs and non-finite verbs. Finite verbs can function as the main verb of independent clauses, while non-finite verbs cannot act as main verbs. We said that earlier, that finite verbs function as the main verbs of independent clauses, but non-finite verbs cannot function as main verbs because they do not specify tense, person, or number. Another difference between finite and non-finite verbs is that finite verbs can express tense, person, and number, but non-finite verbs do not express tense, person, or number. Instead, they play the role of nouns and adjectives in sentences. So these are the two major differences between finite and non-finite verbs in sentences. We've come to the end of our lesson today on finite and non-finite verbs. But before we wrap up, let's take a look at what we have learned so far. Today we learned that finite verbs are the group of verbs that can express tense, person, and number. We also learned that non-finite verbs are verbs that do not express tense, number, or person. We also learned today that non-finite verbs function as infinitives, gerunds, present participles, and past participles in sentences. Also, we learned that finite verbs function as main verbs in sentences, but non-finite verbs do not. And lastly, we learned that non-finite verbs function as nouns and adjectives in sentences. Now let's go to our question section. Our first question for today says, identify the finite verb in the following sentence. I love to swim, but yesterday I cooked for my family instead. What is the finite verb in this sentence? Is it A, love, B, swim, or C, cooked? The correct answer is C, cooked. Cooked is a finite verb in the sentence because it expresses past tense. And we did say that finite verbs are verbs that can express tense, person, or number. So the verb cooked here is in past tense, as we can see the suffix ed here. So if you picked cooked, you are correct. Our second question for today says, identify the non-finite verb in this sentence below. Kim dislikes walking long distances. Is it A, dislikes, B, walking, or C, long? The correct answer is B, walking, because walking does not express any form of tense here, and we did say in our lesson that non-finite verbs do not express tense, person, or number. So if you picked B, you are correct. We've come to the end of our lesson today on finite and non-finite verbs. Thank you very much for watching, and see you next time.